All right. Thank you for being here today, travel writer and speaker, and surely photographer along with that, Karen Gershowitz. When
Hi.
I think when I think about travel writing, I think mainly about photography supported by words. But how does travel writing exist for you?
Exactly the other direction.
Hmm.
Uh, I have been keeping a travel journal my whole life, literally since I'm 8 years old. And so I always start with things that really struck me, and then I'll go back and get the pictures. But I don't do it the reverse way. And I am a good photographer and take a lot of photos. But
What kind of camera do you use?
my phone, I used to have a very expensive Nikon, used that for ages. And then I realized that the new phones are as good or better than a lot of the expensive cameras. And this way I always have it with me and it's never a problem. So and the quality is surprisingly good.
Yeah, it has come a long way since those first digital cameras for sure. I like the digital much better than the film just because you can see what you've got without having to worry about did I get it when you develop it. When you started doing it, were you using 35 millimeter and
Oh,
cameras like that?
absolutely. And I used to bring slides, Kodachrome, Ektachrome. And I used to bring, if I was going away for 3 weeks, I would bring a roll of film or 2 rolls of film for every single day. So lots of film, and it was very expensive. Of course, you also had to get it processed. So it's a lot easier now.
Yeah. When did it change over for you to the just taking the to the digital and then to just doing the phone?
I switched to digital I know exactly what it was, in 2000, and because I was taking a year off in 2001. That was my 40th birthday, 50th birthday. Good God, it was my 50th birthday. And I was decided that I had seen all around the world. I've been to 95 countries now, but at that point I'd been to about 75. But I'd never spent time outside of the major cities in the US. And I really wanted to see, I had this laundry list of places that I wanted to go to that really required time and the ability to go off the road and spend days off the road. So that was the year that I decided I needed to switch to digital. And the main reason for that was that I had a website. Before anybody had blogs, I had a blog. So in
Mhm.
2001, every single day I posted with photos and what I had seen and done, the people I'd met. It started out just for family and friends, so they knew where I was and what I was doing, and it grew. And by the end of the trip, I had several thousand people following me.
Wow.
Yeah, and again, it was very, very early. It was, nobody had heard of the word blog at that point, but that's what I was
Yeah.
doing essentially.
I'm not sure I even had email in 2000. I might have been a late adopter of that.
Yeah. Well, that was that was my switch, and then switching over to the phone primarily was my last phone. I just got a brand new one last week, but I had a really good Samsung, top of the line when I got it, which was about 5 years ago. And the phone took fabulous pictures. And the one I've got now is extraordinary. I again went for top of the line Samsung, which for all of the people who are Apple lovers, I hate to say this, but way better than Apple in terms of the quality of the photos. And the new one has got very, very high pixel count. So the detail is extraordinary. You can blow it up and it looks gorgeous, which was not true
Nice.
in the last one.
Yeah, I'm an Apple person, so I got in on that. And the switching cost, I think, is too high now because I'm just invested in everything Apple. But I can appreciate a good camera that you can fit in your pocket for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's it changed the way I did policing back when in the before 2000 we had the cameras and we were taking you'd have to take pictures of crime scenes or whatever you're taking pictures of a certain many rolls for that and then you'd get back send it off to the state police photo lab to get developed, and then find out that one roll out of your 5 rolls actually was taken correctly, even though you've had a bunch of classes in the academy and the continuing education on it, on how to use, apertures and f-stops and what bodies to use, what lenses to use. And then we got to the point where we could use, I got a 35 millimeter camera that I could put the same film in. And I was like, oh, this is going to be much better. It's not, the close-ups weren't as good. But it always developed. So that it was a lot easier. And then when the digital cameras, we didn't get one through the department. I just got a digital camera on my own and started using it. And that was probably back with the 1 megapixel picture, but it still helped if you had somebody that didn't have an ID, or you were taking pictures of something that you needed the pictures quicker. It helped to have it in the phone there, or in the camera. And then when the phone came around, that was even easier. But so when you started using just the phone, what happened to your other cameras then? Did you retire them to a place of honor, or did you?
They sit in a drawer, and it kills me because I have a very expensive Nikon that I went out and I got lenses for, and it's digital. And it took wonderful pictures. The thing weighed a ton. And so it was like, I'd have to think about, do I really want to carry this? So when I was traveling, I took it. But even then it was like, oh, I'm just going to leave it back in the room because I can't be bothered carrying this thing. And now I always have it with me. So of course that makes it a lot easier, and I never have to think about it. But it's a big switch.
Do you do much work with like a macro and micro on your phone? Like,
absolutely.
So you can do the panoramas and then the close-ups too?
Yep. And I do both. And I do a minor amount of editing, but enough that it really looks good, both in terms of framing it and getting the light exactly right. And it's so nice to be able to do that, and do maybe 3 or 4 versions of the same photo and look at them and go, okay, that's the right look. Yeah,
we recently went on a trip to South America, and there was a travel writer in the group with us, and they had the different camera bodies and the giant cameras. And then most of the tour guides, when we were on Galapagos, had their own cameras too, giant cameras. And I just had the phone, and I'm taking there were pictures okay, because it captures what you're trying to capture as much as a camera can. And then I look at her pictures, the travel writers, and I was like, oh, okay. That's the difference between a camera like that and then the phone camera. I'm not sure of how big a difference it is between Apple and Samsung.
It's huge.
But
it really is huge.
Maybe they'll get up to speed on that sometime. I did consider taking just a small digital camera, but then you have those weight restrictions of 25 pounds for a bag for your carry-on, and it has to be a certain size. So I just went with the phone, and then if it gets stolen, you're just out the phone instead of all your camera stuff and everything.
Well, I'll give you a tip. By the way, if you have a phone, bring an old phone along, because you now have a backup. And so if it gets stolen, it gets lost, whatever, it'll still work perfectly well as a camera. And when you're at Wi-Fi, you can use it and download anything you want to download.
Pro tip.
Yeah.
All right. File that away. When you go travel, do you take a checked bag, or are you mainly carry-on only?
Carry-on only. If I can't carry it on, it doesn't come. I did make one exception. Last year, I went to Antarctica, and there was no way I was fitting clothes for being in what was, we started from Buenos Aires, and it was very warm in Buenos Aires. And then, of course, once we got to Antarctica, it was freezing. So that one required a checked bag, but that is the only time in the entire year I check the bag. And usually I can go 2-3 years and not check a bag.
Yeah, that cold weather gear gets bulky. You can't really wear that onto the plane. That's going to look strange.
Yeah, especially in the summer, although it's winter. Because I was leaving, I did have actually, now that I think about it, down jacket, because those seasons are reversed. So
when you do, you're thinking about where you're going to go and what story you're going to write about it or things you want to do there, do you plan that out, or do you say, I'm going to go to this place and then you see what happens? You have maybe a general idea about it, or how detailed are you in your plannings?
The latter. The less planned, the happier I am. I'm going to go to a place. And once I get there, I'm going to explore. Now, you have to also understand that at this point, as I said, I've been to 95 countries, and a lot of them many, many, many times. So I have no interest in going to the tourist attractions. I've been there. I've done that. Not going to do that. I like serendipity, and I like getting lost. My idea of a really fun day is to take a bus or a tram or whatever, if I'm in a city, and just take a random one, not knowing where it's going. Look around. If I see something interesting, get off. Go have coffee at a cafe. Excuse me. And that's how you get to see what a culture is really like. It's not from the tourist attractions. I live in New York City, and I joke about all the time that people say, New Yorkers are horrible people. I was like, really, where were you? Well, I was at Times Square. I was at the Statue of Liberty. I went to the UN. I said, yeah, those were all other tourists that you were interacting with. And they were hot and tired, and, they've been waiting on lines for a long time. If you come out to where I live, I guarantee that's not going to be your experience, and people are going to be very friendly. So I like just getting lost. And if I've got a car, I will deliberately take back roads. And I've discovered amazing things. I was up on Vancouver Island last spring, and I had some time. I had visited someone fairly far north on the island. And I said, I'm just going to wander back. I'm going to meander. I'm not going to use GPS. I'm just going to, go south, because that's the direction I need to go. And I saw a little sign that said woodworker, and I happened to like crafts, so follow the sign. Go up on a dirt road. Then I see there's another sign, pottery. Anyhow, it turns out that this was an entire mountain. It was dirt roads. It was gorgeous, of craftspeople. I stopped at the first studio. They were charming. They were absolutely lovely. They said, oh, you've got to go visit my friend so-and-so. They've got a great shop, a great studio. So that's where I went. I spent probably the better part of an afternoon. I would never have known about it. I would never have seen it. And I would never have had those kinds of in-depth conversations with people, because it's not, it's just off the beaten path. And to me, that's the joy of traveling, is finding things that are not what you expect. And I've had that all over the globe. That happened to be in Canada, but I can tell you similar stories in Asia and South America, in Africa, in Europe, you name it. And people are amazingly friendly, kind of pretty much no matter where you go.
Well, that pottery was probably interesting. Didn't you go to school for ceramics?
I did. I have a bachelor's and a master's of fine arts in ceramics. So
nice. So you got to wow the local craftspeople with your knowledge of ceramics.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
fun.
Yeah. Well, it has served me well on a number of occasions. And talk about, interacting with people. If I see anybody doing ceramics, I say to them, can I, and I make gestures, because it's often they don't speak English. May I do it? Okay. And they think it's going to be, something weird, or that I'm going to be incapable of it. And of course I can actually do it. And I had an experience in Japan. I was way out in the wilds, going to a ceramic studio. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story. It's in my book, but I'm looking around and I'm going, boy, this is really interesting. I want to try doing this. And I ask if I can do it. And the guy who's in charge kind of went, okay. And I'm sure he thought that, there wasn't going to hope in hell I was going to be able to do this. And then, of course, I threw a perfect pot. I just go, whoa. And he comes back with everybody from the studio, do it again. So I could prove to them that I actually could do it, because in Japan, at the time I was doing this, no woman would have touched the clay. They did the decorating, but they never actually threw a pot. So it was an interesting cultural experience all around.
When you get off the beaten path and you see those things, how do you decide the angle or how your story is going to develop for your travel writing?
I absolutely don't think about it. Every day I write a journal entry, every single day when I'm traveling. And if anybody's interested, you can follow me on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Instagram. But every single day I write for about an hour, and I usually do it the next morning. And I'm not writing, again, I saw this, I went here or there, although sometimes there's a little bit of that. But it's what were those really unique experiences? Where did I connect with people? And then I'll come back and think about how I want to write the story. But I don't do it at the time because that's going to send me off in directions that are going to sometimes stop that serendipity. And that's the part that to me is fun. And I'll give you an interesting example. I was down in New Orleans, and it was actually my career has changed. This was not my career, but I was in New Orleans, and I was absolutely fascinated because I took a lot of Ubers, and every time I took an Uber, I got into a conversation with the driver. And none of them were native to New Orleans, and everyone had a story. And I didn't think much of it, except that when I got back and was writing my travel journal, I was writing about these conversations. Well, I ended up writing a story that got published that was called New Orleans Through the Eyes of Uber Drivers. And everybody loved it. The editor immediately accepted it, thought it was just this fun angle on it. And if I had thought about it at the time, I don't think it would have been as interesting. I was just talking to them because I got caught in traffic a couple of times and somebody took me to the completely wrong place. All kinds of strange things were going on. But it was just a fun experience that could not have planned.
And while all that stuff's going on, are you taking pictures of things that you find interesting from maybe not a tourist thing, but a tourist perspective, but more of a people might not pay attention to this, so you try to bring their attention to that?
Yeah. And I think the fact that I was trained in the arts, I have a really good visual sense, and I notice a lot. And I notice a lot of things that most people don't. And I've traveled with people and said, "Oh my God, did you just see the blah, blah, blah?" Then they'll look at me, "What are you talking about?" And I'll show them the picture and say, "You just saw that?" I was like, "Yeah, it was just there." And it's really training yourself and to just be very aware of your surroundings and see what's around you and what's going on.
I do find that helps if you're doing a fictional story or a report or whatever, that it does help to observe a lot. And maybe it's from policing in the military, trying to avoid tunnel vision. But, when you're at the range and you're shooting, you look left, look right to avoid the tunnel vision. So, and then maybe it's not hypervigilance, but for me, probably born out of that, of just trying to see what else is going on. If there's something big that's happening, my maybe learned response to it is to try to make sure I'm looking at my surroundings to see if this is a distraction for something else. And I think that helps with travel because that's how you do see the things that most people don't, is they're busy looking at whatever. And then you see a lizard crawling on a wrought iron fence through a whatever colored flower. And you're like, oh, that's going to be a good picture there. So,
yeah. Well, or things like I can remember when there was a brand new museum and everybody was, and it was a very famous architect. I can't remember who it was, but everybody was looking at the building and taking pictures in front of it, doing selfies. And I didn't take any pictures of the building. I was taking pictures of everybody taking selfies. Mm. And it was so much fun, way more interesting than the pictures of the building would have been, was watching, and you saw the building in it, but it was all these people getting into these strange poses and kneeling and, and doing all kinds of strange things. And it was a series of maybe 25 or 30 photos that were incredible, and just great fun, because they were not what everybody else was looking at.
Yeah. Do you have, that's pro tip for if you're ever falling asleep in a lecture or a class or wherever, instead of trying to fight the sleepies, because no matter how big and bad you are, the sleepies are gonna win. You look for other people that are in a battle with the sleepies, and then that keeps you awake. You might not be paying attention to what the class is about, but at least you're awake.
At least you won't be snoring.
Yeah. The with pictures like that or subjects like that, do you have other things that you take pictures of or you look for in certain places that might not be a thing that most people take pictures of, like, sewer covers, or for me, it's old barns or trash corrals for some reason. I like a nice trash corral. I think I need to do a book about those, but what do you have?
Yeah. I like taking pictures. I've always loved taking pictures of flowers, but what I particularly like taking pictures of are plants that manage to grow in places where they probably shouldn't be growing. That have somehow gotten onto a wall that, why is that thing? How did it ever get there? Or alone something when, there's nothing else like it anywhere near it. So I do a lot of those. I like really odd signs. I'm drawn to peculiar signs, and I've got them from all over the globe. Some of them are hilarious. One of my favorite was in China, and I don't think they still do it because I was back there right before the pandemic and I didn't see any of it. But they used to grade the bathrooms, and you could have anything from a 1-star to a 5-star toilet. And so, yeah, in parts of Beijing and parts of some of the other large cities. And so I was taking pictures of all these, 5-star bathrooms and what it actually
useful.
Like, right?
Oh,
versus a 2-star bathroom.
Did you find it the rating system was accurate for the most part?
Not even close. No. Oh. It was like somebody randomly put them up, but they were pretty funny.
That's a giant scandal that the bath rating system is not accurate.
Yeah, I think it also
that's a whole story on that.
Yeah, well, I think it also depends on who happened to visit that day, and how much they've been cleaning it.
In our office building, they put in like a magnetic lock on the bathroom once upon a time. And this was rare because it hadn't been like that for the years before. So then I put a sign-up sheet on the door for both the bathrooms that said your time in, time out, and number 1, number 2, or both. And I came back the next day and there were like 5 or 6 people that filled them out on both of them before they took them down. But that was going to be interesting stuff just to have for prosperity, Posterity. Yeah.
Prosperity, if you manage to figure out how to sell it, but yeah,
for both. But
it's I always talk about the fact that if you go with this intent of checking things off a list, that makes you a tourist. If you go with the intent of understanding a place, that makes you a traveler. And I'm all for being a traveler, not being a tourist. I don't need to check anything off a list. I don't care if I've gone somewhere that is renowned for something. If there's an hour line to get in, I'm not going. That's just the end of it. I am not waiting online for an hour for anything, because I can find things that are as interesting, maybe not as notable or as considered important, but certainly as interesting without having to do that. And so to me, I have seen too many people who don't understand that checking things off a list is really not traveling. And I wish I could convince people that I mean, I understand if you've never been somewhere before, if you've never been to Paris, you are going to go to the Eiffel Tower and you are going to go to the Arc de Triomphe. But after you've done that, go look in other places, not to the things that are the must sees.
In going back to places you've been before, have you seen a lot of difference over time? Or
some places I go to so frequently, like London is, like people take a crosstown bus. I go to London just because I have a lot of friends there and I lived there for several years. But there are places that I won't go back to now because I have an image in my head of what it was like when I first went there. And a good example of that is Bali. I went there the first time in the 80s, and Bali was beautiful. It was unspoiled, and it was, the culture was so strong. The second time I went back, less so. The Australians had discovered it, and there were Aussies everywhere. Although not everywhere. They were sticking mainly to the main beach areas. The third time I went back, which was in the early 2000s, I swore I was never going back because it had turned into the Miami Beach for Australians. And it had lost, unless you went way to the opposite end of the island from where the beach towns are, it had lost its personality to a large degree. Yes, they still performed the dances, and yes, they were still having their ceremonies, but it was not the same, even remotely. The first time I had gotten invited to a wedding, they didn't know me, but I was a tourist, and a foreigner, and I happened to chat with someone, and they said, oh, my neighbor's daughter's getting married. Come, it's a big party. I don't think that would happen now. And on the other hand, if you go to the next island east, which is Lombok, I went there the same time that I went back to Bali. Lombok was pristine because it's a Muslim island, and a lot of people were very afraid of going to any of the Muslim islands. They were far more interested in, going to the ones that were either Hindu or actually almost any other religion. But but the Muslim islands were absolutely empty, and Lombok is beautiful. It's absolutely gorgeous and totally unspoiled. And it's not very far, but you have to go away from, Bali is what everybody knows. So that's where everybody ends up going to. And I will not go back because I have this pristine image in my mind of what it was like the first time I went there. And I've seen it in a lot of places, by the way.
I wonder if the biggest driver of that is just the commercialism, where the people that are there think, okay, this is what people are coming to do. So we're going to have all these shops you could probably find the analogs to them in places around the world. Like if you go to Virginia Beach and you go to the Strip, it's going to look very similar to Jacksonville Beach or to any other beach town that's up there. The same type of shops, different names on the towels, but the same thing. So I wonder if it's the commercial side that's the strongest driver of change, or is it the expectation of the people coming there that is?
It's both. It's both. Okay. It's both. I still remember talking about great signs, and I've got a picture of it. It was on one. They do beautiful crafts on Bali, really beautiful crafts. And there was a furniture maker that had a big sign in the front of the store: "Antiques made to order." Like that about sums it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can find a lot of stores around now that have the people that it's like a store from, they say it's things from Bali, and it might be that it's just a bunch of like a hodgepodge collection of things because people have gone over there and filled a shipping container full of artisan things and then brought them back here. And then I wonder how much of that stuff you can just copy once you get here and say, okay, we're going to make some more benches that look like that, or some more carvings that look like this.
Probably you can, but not for the same kind of price. That would be the difference, is that here, things are far more expensive.
Mm.
But I'm sure it does happen. And, that would not surprise me at all. Because most things from Bali have a distinctive look. And I'm certainly not beyond anybody to copy it. But yeah, it's an interesting case because when I first went there, I remember a friend who had been living in Indonesia and said to me, yeah, Bali isn't what it was, because she had been there in the early 70s. And she said in 10 years, it's gotten very commercial. And when I went there, I thought it was absolutely spectacular. And then I went back, 10 or 15 years later and went, oh my God, what have they done? And then went back another 10 years later, and it was even further down the curve of getting away from the culture. So
When when you're when you decide what you're going to write about for your travel stories or your travel log blogs or articles, do you take pictures that support that story, or are you matching them up with just pictures that you've taken along the way because that they occurred at the same time that you did the story? Like how much planning goes into the pictures for the story?
very little, because I truly don't think about the story or writing. I'm writing a journal, but I'm not writing a story. I never write stories unless I'm home. When I'm home is when I'm writing. When I'm traveling, I'm not even thinking about it. I mean, I hadn't thought about the Uber driver one until I got home. And had I thought about it, I would have taken pictures of the Uber drivers. I don't have a single one. And that's not something that I can somehow conjure up.
Right.
But I had plenty of pictures of the areas that I was in New Orleans, and that had to suffice.
The police in me says you should take a picture of all your Uber drivers just in case something happens that it's in your phone. But maybe that's not the kind of picture you would want for a journal on Uber drivers. Maybe you want more of an action, like over their shoulder driving through wherever, the Statue of Liberty is in the background and then your Uber driver's there. So
yeah. If I ever do another Uber driver story, which I might, because it was so interesting, and I tend to be chatty, and and if I'm taking an Uber in New York, I always talk to the driver, and where are you from? And in New York, they're from everywhere. And so you get great, really interesting stories from people. But somebody said, yeah, you should do Uber drivers in London because you go there so often. You should go to one. I'm going out to Seattle in a few weeks, and I'm not going to rent a car. So, Uber drivers in Seattle. And I said, well, I'll see if it's different enough and interesting enough, I might just do that.
How do you determine if a place is not somewhere you want to go? Like maybe you've been there before, but current events or whatever, for whatever reason, safety or what, you would say, I'm not going to go to that place right now. I'm going to go somewhere else. How do you determine that?
If there's a safety concern, I'm not going. There are enough other places in the world I want to go see that I'm not putting myself in danger. And I'm not a kid anymore. I probably would have done it when I was younger. Now, not so much. There are very few places I won't go to. And I tend to travel alone. I mean, I do travel with friends, but I like traveling alone. And one of the reasons that I like traveling alone is that people are far more willing to talk to you. I have another, one of my little tips here, and I told this to I don't know how many hundreds of people. I always bring a book that's got a very prominent English title on it. I also have my Kindle, but I have a book, and I'll be sitting there, I'm reading my book.
Nice product placement.
Looking around. Hey, of course, got to do that. And people who are there will come up to me because I'm sitting there alone, and they want to practice English. Now, if you're in Africa, if you're in South America, if you're in Asia, it doesn't work so well in Europe, but absolutely in Asia, I cannot begin to tell you how many people have come up to have a conversation with me because I look like a native English speaker. And because I'm alone, they're not interrupting me. Particularly if I look up and, just see what's going on around me. And
So so
as a
that scene
boy,
in The Last Samurai where the shogun or whatever the guy's name or whatever he is, the warlord, the samurai says to Tom Cruise after they've had their English conversation, "I've enjoyed our conversation in English." So that's true. Then that's
oh
based in
yeah,
truth. That's
oh
good.
yeah, absolutely. People, and and if I'm really desperate to speak English or I really want to meet some people, I'll go to a college campus because there always somebody there wants to learn English. And how better to learn it than to have a conversation with somebody who's a native English speaker?
Do you speak any other languages?
Unfortunately, no. And I wish I did. I learned a very bad lesson when I was very young, that I could get away by basically doing really good charades and smiling a lot. And so I never learned another language. And I'm really sorry I didn't. I mean, I speak Spanish. I usually describe it like a not too bright 5-year-old.
Mm.
I can tell you about today. Don't ask me about yesterday or tomorrow because I only ever learned present tense. But enough that people understand what I'm saying. But no, I don't, and I really wish I did. But
On Galapagos, the the tour guides and everything, they spoke English fine, but they also spoke Spanish from other places. So I didn't take Spanish in high school. I took French, 3 years of that. And while I can recite a little bit of Paul Verlaine, that's basically all I could do now. And then we've been taking, before we went down to South America, we took Spanish on a language learning app for about 6 months. And you feel like you're like, okay, I'm ready. We go to some Mexican restaurants locally, and then you try to order and you're like, okay, maybe I'm not conversational in Spanish.
right,
And if I have a minute to think about it, and I think that does go back to the maybe a poor, not poor, but a not so well speaking 5-year-old is probably a 5-year-old that spoke Spanish could probably speak better Spanish than me. But most of mine I learned from West Coast Marines when I was in there. And then I forgot a lot of that, which was probably good because it wasn't nice Spanish.
yeah,
And then learning on the language learning app, we go down to Galapagos and I was talking to one of the guides and he goes, "You sound like you're from Mexico." I was like, "Oh, well then success.
right.
Now I can fit in with Mexico Spanish." So
Yeah. Well, my favorite words in Spanish are otra vez and más
mm,
despacio.
mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah, good at saying that, and they get that I just slow down.
Yeah. I'll always put like a on the end of American words and then figure that's Spanish.
Right, there
That
you go.
doesn't work out too. So I just go with the Spanish until I don't know what it is. I throw the English in and then I keep going with the Spanish.
Hey,
It works sometimes.
yeah, people are often willing to try. I have a great story. If you have, it's not
Yeah, let's hear
exactly a
it.
travel story, but it's a very funny one.
Okay.
What I did for a career for most of my career was I was a marketing researcher and marketing strategist, and I was asked to run a series of meetings in Singapore, and it was for all of the heads of countries. For it was an American company, but they had people all over Asia. They're all sitting in a room, and it has to do with how they're going to improve communications. And I'm running the meeting, and the first day, I say, "Could you introduce yourself? Go around the room and everybody introduce yourself." First person does it, great, and I say thank you, and everybody's looking at me. Nobody has understood a word that he said because he had a very, very heavy accent. So I translated what he had said. We go around the room. It happens with every single person. They can't understand each other at all because of the accents. But they all have watched American movies, American TV, so they can understand me. So I became a translator from English to English. And at the end of the day, I was so exhausted, I cannot begin to tell you. So I said, I got to figure out a way to get these people to understand that they need to ask each other to repeat things. So went in the next morning and said, we are going to play a game called telephone. has anybody ever played telephone? And they had no idea what it was. So we played telephone. And by the time we got to the end, I said, and so what do you take from this? We don't understand each other. Good point. Maybe you need to ask someone to repeat it. Now, it's okay if you do that. By that alone, they improve their communications by about 90%.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. There's a lot of times when somebody's saying something to me in another language and I just go along with it. So I imagine it's the same the other direction too.
Yeah. But it was, I said, somebody once said to me, so have you ever, I said, well, I can translate English to English. I can do that really well because I understand accents because I've done so much traveling. So I really have a good ear for it. But
yeah, you need that sometimes. It's kind of, you see it in some British movies when they're talking about, or maybe you have somebody with the thicker English accent that people are like, what did they say? I've seen that a few times. And then just working as a mechanic before, talking to mechanic folk versus regular folk can be a little different too. So,
yeah, well, everybody's got their jargon and lingo and,
yeah.
English doesn't sound the same around the world for sure, even when that's your first language.
I saw a Instagram thing recently of I think it was in India, a guy that doesn't speak English, like fake speaking English. And you're like, oh, that's what we sound like to them. And it was pretty good. John Wayne was in there. It was in what he said. So, I mean, he's been watching some TV, but yeah, it was good.
Yes. Yeah, well, John Wayne also figures prominently. I went to Paris in the early 70s and I'm with some other people, all of whom are French-speaking natives. And they have a TV show on. It's an old movie with John Wayne, except it was dubbed. And John Wayne spoke in a very, very, very high-pitched voice.
Oh,
and
nice.
I burst out laughing. Yeah. They're all looking at me like, what is so funny? It's like, John Wayne, know what he sounds like.
The Duke would not be happy.
No, the Duke would not have been happy. Sort of sounded like Mickey Mouse.
It's when you look at those, like some of the Netflix shows that are dubbed over and they have the same voice actors in radically different types of shows. And you're like, I know that voice. I know that voice. That's from this other show. And it's interesting.
Yeah. But
do you think that the creativity or wherever that idea of what you're going to write a story about or what catches your eye when you're traveling and then what catches your eye that you take a picture of, do you think that the source of that creativity comes from the same place?
I've never thought about that. I suspect it does. It's a way of looking at the world, of having a certain perspective on the world. Maybe that I find wonder in. I'm curious about everything. And it's the curiosity that ultimately is what's behind all of it. And it's this curiosity to understand things and to see things and to engage other people in what I've experienced. One of my reasons for writing the 2 books was that I truly want people to travel because I think it would resolve a lot of the problems in the world when you understand there's not one right way of doing things. There are many right ways of doing things. And that culturally we do it one way, but that culturally perfectly acceptable, people do it a different way. And I don't think that there's anything you can read or look at that will get you there. You have to have the experience of being somewhere that you're out of your element, but you see the things function really well in a very different way.
I agree. The experience is much different. And then when you have something explained to you, whether you go with like a Hemingway version of travel where it's prose explaining things and trying to take you to the place, or a picture, it can be misleading. Like a picture of Mount Rushmore, and you go, wow, that's big. That's pretty imposing. And then you drive up to Mount Rushmore and you see just on the end of the mountain up there, and you go, oh,
Yeah.
well, that's really, I'm sure it's impressive. I mean, I couldn't have done it, but that's not what the pictures make you think. And then you can take a picture of it, zoom in, crop around it, and you go, oh, okay, there's the Mount Rushmore. I
Right.
know.
Right.
I didn't realize it was just that little part of the mountain. And then you go to the Grand Canyon and you're like, wow, I'm never going to capture this feeling in a picture.
Exactly.
There's just, I can take a picture of this, but you're not going to get it. Even in a panoramic picture, you're not going to get it. And I think in my travels, that's when I found that the natural things are mainly more breathtaking or awe-inspiring than the made things. That you can look at the Grand Canyon, for instance, and go, wow, that's something. But then Mount Rushmore, you go, okay.
Well, I like architecture, so I love looking at architecture, old architecture, new architecture, because to me that's an art form in itself, and how people have seen the world and how it's changed over time. And sometimes you've got something ultra modern next to something that's really old, and I love the contrast of the two. But that's it also speaks, again, if you're in a city, to the character of a city, that the new and the old, are just right up against each other.
Yeah. Do you, besides the view of, if other people would travel, they'd get the perspective of being there and understand societies better, what other things have you learned, maybe top 3 things learning from traveling?
Well, I know that the top thing I've learned is that underneath it all, humans pretty much all want the same thing. And, yes, we have wars, and yes, we have all kinds of horrible things happen, but most people want to live a happy, healthy life. They want their children to be educated. They want food on the table. We may define what a nice place to live is quite differently. We may have very different ideas about what a good meal is, but underneath it, we're all looking for the same thing. So that's absolutely the first thing. The second thing is that people, and I can't stress this enough, all over the world are very generous and giving. I've been in places where I did not anticipate that to be the case. And once you break down this barrier, it is amazing how just stupendously generous people can be everywhere. And the third thing maybe is that you've never seen it all. If I lived to be 200 years old, I would never see it all, because it's constantly changing. There's the old adage, there's the only thing that doesn't change is that there's change. And that's true, because you go back to the same place that you think you saw and you knew perfectly well, and you go back 6 months later and it's different. And there's, and I don't just mean in terms of the landscape or the architecture, but there's new food fad. Suddenly everybody's eating whatever, because that's become the big thing. Or people dress differently. When I first started traveling, I used to be able to tell in Europe, just by looking at someone, how they were dressed and what their shoes looked like, what country they were from. And I was right probably 85% of the time, 85 to 90% of the time. Now, impossible. Everybody's wearing jeans and sneakers. But that was not the case when I first started traveling. And it's wildly different. And the world's become a lot smaller, partially the internet and communications, but, things travel like wildfire around the globe. um, even in remote places, and things that you just don't anticipate. I remember being in northern Thailand, way north. I mean, way north, and they had just gotten electricity, like maybe a few months before. They had one TV in the town, and every kid, I swear it was every kid in town, was sitting around in a circle on the ground, and they had the TV up there watching Mickey Mouse cartoons. They had never seen Mickey Mouse, didn't know what Mickey Mouse meant, anything about it, but they were mesmerized by it. And it could have been a group of kids, I suspect, if you did that anywhere on the globe.
Yeah. Well, I know you have the 2 books, and then you have your blog that you can get to through your website. What do you have? Are you working on anything else, like for book-wise now?
I'm working on a third book. Yeah, I'm working on a third book. I'm already well into it. I also write for a publication called Journeywoman, which is for solo female travelers over age 50. And I'm kind of a staff writer for them. And great organization. It's free to join. It's on the internet, and lots of great information and tips and all that kind of thing. And then I have 2 or 3 other magazines that I contribute to on a fairly regular basis. So I'm busy, as I said, I'm well into my 3rd career at this point. And never, if you had told me this 10 years ago, I would have not believed it. So,
do you have links to all those, the places you write for on your website?
I need to put them up. Some of them are there, but not all of them. I've been very remiss in working on my website, but the best place to follow me, quite honestly, is on either Facebook or LinkedIn, because that's where I'm posting. You want to know anything I'm doing, that's where it's going to be. Okay.
I'll get those links from you after we record, and I'll put them in the show notes. I have your website. I like your website.
Yeah.
It's a good looking website. I like the pictures on there.
Those are my
the camera. Yeah, the camera's good. And then it has your books.
With my phone. They're all with my phone.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's KarenGershowitz.com. And again, that'll be in the show notes for anybody that wants to look at it. And I have a couple other links from other things that you have as well, but I'll add the LinkedIn and your Facebook one. Yeah, and they'll all be in there. Good. Do you have any thoughts in closing, or anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't talk about?
Well, one of the things that I've been doing recently is trying to convince people who, either because of COVID or because of things going on in the world, have decided it's too scary to travel. And I really want to convince people that they should encourage them to get out there and go see the world. And the world doesn't have to be going to Asia. Take a map, draw a 100-mile radius around your home, and I can almost guarantee, no matter where you are in the country, there will be interesting things to go see and do. So start locally. There are always things. During COVID, when I really couldn't travel, I was taking road trips, after the first 6 or 8 months, which were horrendous. But after that, I was feeling like a caged animal. So I have a car, and I was getting out and just discovered things, very close to me that I never knew existed. And I developed several new passions. I really got into street art, all kinds of things. But I think that people have this feeling like, if I'm going to travel, it's got to be this big deal, and it's going to cost a fortune, and I have to prepare for it. And no, just go locally. Start out that way, and go explore what's around you. That's being as much of a traveler as anything else. So,
I agree. There's a lot in the U.S. just to see as well. So,
the U.S. is a gorgeous country with totally diverse geology, totally diverse many things. Yes, we are all wearing the same clothes, but not eating the same foods. You go down to Louisiana and you go up to Maine, and trust me, they're not eating the same things.
Yeah. All right. Well, I know you have a time limit, so I don't want to go over that. Thank you very much for your time. And again, all your website and your social media stuff I'll put in the show notes so people can check that out.
Great. Thank
And
you. It's been a pleasure.
yeah, thank you very much. I'll talk to you on the other side of this.
Okay.